Hello, everyone. I know we're all looking forward to the social meal where we're going to improve our own well-being, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about improving the well-being of other people and doing so cost effectively. The basics here is that we want to do good, and doing good is great. Doing more good is better. And I'm a researcher at the Happier Lives Institute. We do this sort of research. We do research about well-being, and we do cost effectiveness analyses in order to make recommendations for people who want to donate money or redistribute resources. And I'd like to focus today on setting well-being priorities in the real world based on the cost effectiveness of psychotherapy in low and middle income countries. I forgot the clicker, that'd be useful. All the work I'm presenting today is the product of all of these lovely people. And at the Happier Lives Institute, we think that well-being is the outcome that matters and that you can measure it with these questions that you all know. We're keen to present our results in terms of well-being adjusted life years, or well-bees, in order to make our results comparable. Like, the idea of a well-be is that it's a 1-point increase on one of these well-being scales over a year. And the work we do is only possible because of how far the well-being research field has got to, thanks to all of you. So we know a lot about measurement of well-being, we know a lot about correlates of well-being. Some people are taking this work about well-being to policymakers and informing them about it. And in the UK, we're even so fortunate to have guidelines for how to do the well-being cost effectiveness analysis in the Treasury's Green Book. We think there are some areas where we're a bit thin on the ground. Notably, we think there's a lack of cost effectiveness analyses of interventions and how they impact well-being, and so a lack of comparison between interventions. We've seen today in Anthony's presentation that most of the research is in high-income countries rather than low-income countries, which is a shame because that's where the well-being need is greatest, and because a dollar there goes much further than a dollar here. Also, there's a lack of kind of specific data about interventions. We have a lot about panels and correlations with different situations, but not necessarily about interventions trying to impact people's well-being. All this leads to a lack of actionable recommendations. So if you are someone who wants a private donor who wants to increase well-being by funding charities or giving to charities, it's a lack of knowing which are the best charities to improve global well-being. If you're a public policymaker, you may like some kind of micro information. For example, how should you distribute the aid budget? Some people do this kind of work of prioritization, but they tend not to use the well-being approach. So we want to use the well-being approach, evaluate a few different interventions, and make recommendations on this basis. We've evaluated a few different interventions and their cost effectiveness. Today, I'm going to focus just on cash transfers and psychotherapy. That's a core comparison. So with $1,000 in a low-income country, you could send a cash transfer with that money and double the income of a household, or you could provide lay delivered psychotherapy to 70 people with depression. So how do you choose between these two interventions? Well, as I said, we think well-being is the good that matters. And so we want to know how cost-effective each type of intervention is at increasing people's well-being. Why cash and psychotherapy? Well, cash is increasingly becoming the gold standard in terms of charity recommendations, and also it's taking some importance in aid work. So a lot of the budget, the EU aid budget, went to cash transfers more so than for mental health. And cash transfers work. They do improve people's well-being. And if your intervention isn't better than just giving people money, if it's not more cost-effective than it, then there's a problem. But we know that there are ways in which interventions could be better than cash if people won't purchase the intervention or if people can't access the intervention. In our case for psychotherapy, we know there's very little access to psychotherapy in low-income countries. A lot of the countries for the charities that we're evaluating, you can't just go out and purchase psychotherapy. You need the charities to be there to provide it. And we know that mental health is strongly correlated with well-being, so we think psychotherapy might be a good contender for a cost-effective way of improving well-being. Okay, so you want cost effectiveness. For this, you need the effect of the intervention on well-being, divided by the cost to deliver the intervention. And there's lots of ways you could go and get this information. But I'd like to kind of show you a very kind of thorough approach with our focus on our psychotherapy analysis. And I think here's the place to go into some of the nitty-gritty detail. One of these things that we need to be thorough is not rely on just one study with one effect, but run meta-analyses of multiple studies. So we ran meta-analyses for both interventions. We have up to 72 randomized controlled trials in our psychotherapy meta-analysis. And I'm now going to give you some nitty-gritty details, but I have to give the disclaimer that this is a working report. These are preliminary results. They're probably changing as the moment as I'm speaking to you. But yeah, psychotherapy meta-analysis, 72 RCTs. These 72 RCTs are after a first process of kind of eliminating studies in order to improve the accuracy of our results. So we removed high risk of bias studies, and we removed kind of extreme outliers who had like hard to believe effects. And we get an average effect psychotherapy in low middle income countries on people's well-being of 0.6 standard deviations. This tells us that psychotherapy does increase people's well-being, which is great, but it lacks a little bit of granularity. What happens after the end of the psychotherapy program? How does people's well-being improve over time? So to do that, we moderate our effects with the time at which the effect size was collected after the end of the intervention. And we find that people's well-being improves, but then it declines over time, likely because people adapt or because people forget some of the skills that they've learned. Just typically, we see that interventions and their effect on well-being decline. This is represented graphically here. So all of these points are different effect sizes. And this blue line is the meta-regression line of the effect over time. And you can see that the effect kind of reaches zero around 3 years. And this blue shaded area under the line, that's the integral, that's the whole effect on the individual, on their well-being over time. It's the total effect in standard deviation integrated over years, standard deviation years. To compare to cash transfers, the effect of psychotherapy starts higher, but decays faster. And so that's one thing that's interesting, is that these interventions have different coefficients for these things, and we want to take this into account. Okay, I've mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to present our results in terms of well-beings, but up to now I'm doing a meta-analysis, so my results are in standard deviations, and the integral is in standard deviation years. So how do I get well-beings? Well, the good news is that I have both an effect and a time variable in one, just like the well-be. So I just need to convert. To do that, we assume that the well-be is one of the classic kind of subjective well-being measure scales, 0 to 10 scale, and we need to get a standard deviation from one of these scales so that we can transform the results back. We're using the Cantor ladder just because the Gallup-Well poll has loads of data with standard deviation, and the average standard deviation is about 2 points. So we times the well-be effects by 2, and that gives us the results. And lo and behold, both interventions have a very similar effect of about 2.3, 2.4 well-be's. So cool, we can take this and go on and do our cost effectiveness, but first we want to do a few things to make sure that we have the most accurate result for psychotherapy. We want to do some internal validity adjustments. We want to get the most accurate results with the data that we have, but we also want to do some external validity adjustments. This is about generalizing or predicting to the implementation context. So we're looking at specific interventions, evaluating, for example, specific charities. And so we want to make sure that our results are representative of the charity as it's implementing its program. For example, we're evaluating Friendship Bench, which is a charity that delivers lay-delivered one-to-one psychotherapy in Zimbabwe. And so we want to make sure that our results take some of these characteristics into account. And because we're evaluating specific interventions, we also have extra sources of data that we want to integrate into our results. So about internal validity, first, we use a lot of effective mental health measures. That's the majority of our effect sizes here. These are measures like depression scales and anxiety scales, and we don't adjust for that. We treat them kind of one-to-one with classical subjective well-being scales for a few reasons. First, well, they are kind of imprecise measures of well-being. They do ask people like low mood, low thoughts, all those things, despite also asking like behavioral things like how much do you sleep? If we only use the classical subjective well-being measures, we would get almost no analysis done of interventions in low middle income countries. And we ran some analysis comparing between and within studies the subjective well-being and the mental health scores, and found no difference. If anything, using the mental health scores is like slightly more conservative. So we don't adjust for that, but we do adjust for publication bias, because there are some signals of potential publication bias in our meta-analysis. And there's no like one rules-all method for correcting for publication bias. So we run a panel of them and take the average of the adjustment they suggest. and they suggest we should adjust our results by 30% discount. So we take that into account. And then there's other internal validity stuff, but I want to move on to external validity, where we want to make sure that our results are representative of the implementation of the intervention. So we take a bunch of moderators that we've extracted in our meta-analysis that we think are important in determining the effect of the intervention in the context as we're evaluating them. And we can kind of plug in our numbers and get an adjustment from there. So for example, I mentioned that Friendship Bench was lay delivered. This means they don't have like a clinician and an expert clinician that gives all of the psychotherapy. The clinicians train people from the community who will then deliver the program. And you can see here that this is a decline in the effectiveness of psychotherapy. So we want to take this into account. Although this might reduce the effect, it might also reduce the cost. So it's not necessarily a whole net loss for cost effectiveness, because by doing task shifting, by getting lay therapists, you are reaching way more people and it's costing a lot less than training lots of clinicians in countries that already don't necessarily have many clinicians. And there's all sorts of other variables like dosage that are quite important. So we plug these in and create an adjustment based on that. I mentioned that we had multiple sources of data. So we have this general psychotherapy in low-middle countries, 72 RCTs, but we also have 4 RCTs for Friendship Bench, the intervention itself. So that's great. That's like really relevant data. We want to take that into account. But in the Bayesian sense, it would be kind of silly to completely abandon all of the wealth of information we have from the general psychotherapy and meta-analysis in low-middle income countries. So we want to find the right way to give both of these sources of data. The first step is that we run the analysis with both sources of data independently and then give them weights. The first way we calculate weights is by calculating them based on statistical uncertainty. I'm not going to go into the details here, but we combine the sources with Bayes' rule. That gives more weight to the more statistically precise estimate, and it gives about 60% of the weight to the general psychotherapy. The statistical uncertainty isn't everything that you want to take into account when determining what's relevant. Like the data from Friendship Bench is way more relevant. It's the intervention itself being studied, although it's not like 2024, but it's previous studies of the intervention. And the problem is you can't quantify relevance or other things in the same way that you do with statistical uncertainty. So what we do is that we go through a structure of principles and criteria through the grade criteria, and each analyst gives like subjective adjustments to the weightings based on these things because they're important, but they're not quantifiable. And we come down to a 50-50 weight for each sources of data. Not all of our things end up with 50-50, by the way. It's just this one happens to do that. Yeah. And finally, after all of this, the expected effect in well-bees of an intervention like Friendship Bench, it's about 1 well-bee per person treated. And we can take this, compare it to cash transfers. So cash transfers, much bigger effect. Also, much bigger cost. It costs $1,000 and more to send a $1,000 cash transfer. So you reach fewer people, it's less cost effective, because psychotherapy delivering these programs is actually really cheap. And so you can produce a lot more well-bees with your dollars. One thing I know I keep adding things, but I haven't included household spillovers here. We think this is really important. So if you intervene on someone, it's likely, and it's improving their well-being, it's likely going to improve the well-being of other people around them. I'm so glad we heard about household spillovers earlier. So we want to take this into account. It can represent a really big part of the effect of the intervention. We operationalize this as a percentage of the effect that the non-recipients receive compared to the main recipient. So if you receive a cash transfer, so like someone in a household gets a cash transfer, another member of the household will still get 86% of the well-being benefit. For psychotherapy, we estimate this to be 16%. This is much lower. I like to be really clear that this is based on really few studies. We're extremely uncertain about these numbers. There's so little research that produces anything that helps us quantify this. And even the studies that do this, they're not actually studying household spillovers. They just happen to report like results for all household members. So there's an enormous lack of evidence in this area. I think this is like where new research should be going. Okay, we include this nonetheless, and it increases the effect and the cost effectiveness of both interventions. It has a bit of a bigger effect on cash, but psychotherapy for a charity like Friendship Bench remains 10 times more cost effective, where you can produce a well-be for $12. Yeah, so I'm going to give you a few key takeaways. If there's anything you want to remember from this, these are it. We can use well-being to compare the cost effectiveness of interventions in low middle income countries. And this does provide us actionable recommendations such that improving mental health in low middle income countries is important and cost effective. $12 for a well-be, whilst there's uncertainty around that value, that's really good. And so the well-being approach does provide us with new insights here. But I'm going to end on challenges. Maybe this will spark some interest or opportunities for you. I'm just going to mention challenges for this research, but also all the research that we're doing now, because we're still looking for new cost-effective recommendations to provide people. There's an enormous lack of data, that's like the core of it, about interventions in general, like, but especially about well-being. Like, there's very little well-being data. If you know people who are evaluating interventions, please tell them to add a well-being measure, and a good one. I know I've just presented meta-analyses, so it's like, oh, but you have data, you have like many RCTs. These are probably the two like biggest things we're ever going to be able to do in this area. Everything else, we're like, oh, we have 1 study, 5 studies. So it's a lot harder as soon as we push further. This is compounded by the fact that we run really complex models. Not just because we like running complex models, but if you don't have the data, or if you don't do these bits, then you're making assumptions about these bits. As I showed, like the spillovers are different between cash and psychotherapy. So if you don't think about spillovers, you're assuming that they're both the same. As I mentioned, you don't have a lot of data, and often when you have it, it's not exactly the intervention or the context of the intervention. So you're making extrapolations from that, and that can be very difficult. Especially, and this is something you might not know, in cost effectiveness analysis, there are a lot of subjective adjustments. I'm not saying like decisions about analysis, I mean like people being like, well, we're not sure about this, we're going to discount it by X%, or we're going to imputate this number, or we have to do this way. And so the hope is to reduce this to maximum. Thankfully, in our analysis, the only subjective bit was tweaking the weights we gave to different sources of data. And when we present results, we present like the sensitivity to weights on each data set. So you like Friendship Bench, if you use only like the general psychotherapy or only Friendship Bench RCTs, it's still very cost effective. Like you could have seen, like it wouldn't range that much, but it's still important to show how sensitive it is to the data you have. So yeah, I'm looking forward to tackling these challenges with you all in the coming years. Thank you very much for listening. Continue your questions.
Thank you. I have a question. Do you actually have any way to compare the same people? So is there a way? I guess you can do it with, there are certain techniques that allows you to compare individuals that are very similar that received the different treatment. But is there any study that compares the same person that received the treatment? So what about really, can we really run an experiment where we find a way to give the same person the money and the psychotherapy effect? Then there is another issue, and the issue is that you said that you are looking at mental health because mental health is directly related to well-being. But then what are the root causes of mental health? And what about people suffer because they are actually in an extremely deprived situation? And then you, instead of giving them the money, you give them the psychotherapy. I mean, I guess this is very, very context dependent, especially if you are dealing with developing countries.
Would you rather answer or take another?
Thanks, it's really interesting stuff. I guess my question is basically like, what is psychotherapy? So like, what does Friendship Bench do? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it more like what a priest does? Is it more intense talk therapy? So I know that in the NHS case, the Better Access to Psychological Therapies program, the IAPT or whatever it's called, is CBT, and it's delivered by people with about 2 years of training. And I'm curious what the comparison is in terms of, your intervention.
Running very late, so if you could keep the answer short and then anyone else later.
Good. So some of these kind of go together. First, the psychotherapy is being provided to people who have depression. So they have maladaptive thoughts or patterns of behavior, and the psychotherapy helps them. And then the psychotherapy often then helps them being more productive and be in the system, also spillovers to their households. So we're not saying take a random poor person and give them either cash or psychotherapy. We're saying take someone who has depression and give them psychotherapy. That is a cost-effective way of improving well-being. The psychotherapy itself, what it's doing is, so psychotherapy in general is about changing how people think and behave. As core, most of the schools are around this. Most of the things have like kind of, you talk to someone, you learn about mental health, you learn about your thoughts and behaviors, and you build tools. Friendship Bench and Strong Minds, another charity that we evaluate, they don't do CBT. Friendship Bench does PST, problem solving. Strong Minds does IPT, interpersonal therapy. They're both kind of saying that there's specific things that people need most or affect them. So problem solving has like a program from the World Health Organization, IPT as well. And like one is about relationships, one is about solving problems in your daily life. So that's what's happening here. I think from our site visits and chatting with the charities, a big part that's happening is also psychoeducation. So we take it maybe for granted here that we have some knowledge of mental health and psychotherapy, but there's like reports of people like, I think I have a demon or something. And it's like, oh, actually, you have depression. This is something that like happens, that you're not alone, there's other people with you, and you can receive treatment for this is a big part of what's happening. Also then these, in both these charities, people then tend to join or be part of groups where they exchange help or tips and things. And so it's not like we're saying, don't give people any money. We're saying like, for people who have depression, this is something where they need this treatment. This is how they get better on. There are very few studies that compare cash transfers and psychotherapy. I can talk about it more afterwards.